Good day. My name is Stewart. I'm Nuix's Field Chief Technology Officer, and today I'm going to run you through a Nuix Neo overview. I really focus in on the power of the platform through the use case of X Corp Bank. So, one of the key things to think about with Nuix, and really this is consistent across all of our use cases, is it's really about taking a lot of data and reducing it through any means necessary to get to the right information for your outcome. So whether or not that's an investigation, whether or not that's e-discovery, data privacy, working with consumer complaints, pretty much you name it. All of Nuix's use cases really revolve around taking rich, complex, difficult data, document data, user-generated data, and basically running it through this funnel. And we use all the techniques that we have. And for a long time, sort of in that analog world, we would basically be putting keywords and metadata search, and we still do all that today. But what's exciting about sort of what we're doing with Neo is bringing all of these things together and into the future with how we can start to think about leveraging AI to accelerate outcomes for classification and categorization, but also things like building vector databases to allow us to semantically search for image and text. And then also thinking about how we can start to leverage generative AI in a really sort of fast and efficient fashion to help you deliver those outcomes. But again, regardless of how you think about Nuix, that idea of being able to take all that messy, disparate data, run it through a consistent, repeatable, automated fashion, and sort of winnow that funnel down, it really drives how we think about data and how we want you to think about Nuix, continuing to innovate, but really sort of driving those outcomes as efficiently, as effectively as possible. So what I want to do today is actually tell you that story, but instead of telling you about the funnel, I actually want to talk to you about, again, a fictitious company. So the company is called X Corp Bank, and basically their customers aren't happy. And so essentially, you can imagine any financial services institution, they've got customers, they sort of are protecting people's sensitive assets, their money. And so, they want to protect that and they want to know that it's safe. But X Corp Bank, has silos. So they may be getting customer complaint via emails. They may be getting it online. They may be getting it through their call center. But the point is that not all of those areas are communicating. And so one of the things with Nuix, it's thinking about how can you break down those silos? How can you sort of accelerate that? How can you sort of bring those insights together in a single location? And so many of you may recognize this. This is just sort of a standard internet complaint form. This happens to be the US FICC or the FDIC. And so again, we're going to sort of roll through a little video, but you may recognize this. So again, standard consumer complaint that's basically being filed against someone like X Corp Bank. But what we've done here is we've actually taken that and we've run it through Nuix, and we're starting to understand and define that. And so we're feeding that into our shared knowledge graph. And here what we're doing is we're essentially generating an alert. And what that alert actually does is it looks for, across our knowledge graph, the co-occurrence of multiple connections to a specific Bitcoin address. And so what I'll do is I'll sort of explain some of this. So what you have are sort of all the different elements. This happens to be a node that we've extracted using our cognitive expression. So looking for a Bitcoin address. We then have sort of all of the emails. So again, taking that unstructured data, combining it into a knowledge graph with entities. So it's not purely about communications, and starting to understand and sort of drive those relationships. You can navigate, you can understand, you can sort of, again, really start to dig in and understand all of that interrelationship. And again, start to think about how you can break down those silos. And so in the context of X Corp Bank, they've taken their data, they've run it through Nuix, they've extracted the text and metadata, we've pushed that information into the knowledge graph. We're now visualizing it through our partner Linkurious. And again, all of this is part of Nuix Neo. You can drill in, you can understand all of this, filter, and this is really just sort of one of the first areas in which Nuix is thinking about how organizations can start to break down those silos. But it's not just about the graph visualization. As you can just see, I right-clicked and I ran a custom action, which allows me to jump back in and sort of start to investigate that further. And here I can clearly see that I've actually got that same Bitcoin address. So again, not just an entity on a graph, but actually being able to go back and forth from the technology, understand those relationships, but then provide a fully contextualized view of that information using Nuix Neo's web viewer Investigate. And so when you're in there, you can kind of move back and forth. And so that's a bit of the technology side. But from a business value perspective, imagine being able to break down all of those silos and move not from just sort of an individual noded edge graph visualization, your knowledge graph, but then be able to dip in and look directly at those items to sort of really understand what they are, how they are, with their text, and really sort of foster that investigation. And so sort of back to our X Corp Bank story, you can imagine, like if you actually read some of these emails, they've got about 10 emails, all sort of claiming that individuals are being defrauded or pressured, and they're all sort of asking that the information goes to that same Bitcoin address. So if I'm X Corp Bank, I definitely think I need to dig into this. This seems like a common problem or a potential problem, and the fact that it's all going to the same Bitcoin address is definitely suspicious. So again, taking that consumer complaints, running it through the process, extracting those, and really starting to understand and gain some insights is really important. So we'll sort of advance again. So if I'm X Corp Bank and I sort of see that information and I see that it looks like my customer list or my customers are being targeted for fraud, that may lead me to believe that I have a sensitive data issue. And so with that, again, that next stage of the Nuix Neo platform and our first solution is Nuix Data Privacy. And so again, when we think about Nuix Data Privacy, I'll sort of move myself down here so I'm not sort of in that upper right-hand corner. Let's sort of talk about what that looks like from a process perspective. So one of the key elements for Nuix Neo, again, is automated workflow and the ability to drive a consistent, repeatable, and defensible process across all of the different use cases. So Nuix has 3 core use cases, and we're continuing to expand: data privacy, investigations, and legal. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing automate. And you're essentially seeing the automate workflow that allows us to go from, processing all the way through to that first outcome, which is really the magnitude report. And here you can see that I basically have kicked off my workflow. I've selected my data that I'm going to ingest, sort of what I believe has been breached. So that could be everything from M365, that could be data that exists on a file share. And then the outcome of that first piece, again, is here's what we ran. And the important thing is if you're thinking about data privacy, you're thinking about an automated headless solution, you want to run all of these steps. You want to run it concurrently. You want to run them as fast and efficiently as possible. But then you also sort of want to get some meaningful output. And so with that, for our data privacy solution, that meaningful output is what we just call the magnitude report. And in essence, the magnitude report allows me to, at a glance, understand sort of what is the complexion of all of that data. So we're looking at a summary of items. What is its content types? What is it roughly about? Does it have any corrupt items, etc.? But then across the bottom, across all of the sheets, you actually have a significant amount of item detail. And so when we look at that item detail, this is really sort of one of the key elements of how Nuix thinks about handling these use cases. It's largely about prioritization and helping you as an operator, organization, entity decide what matters most, to focus in on that most important thing as quickly as possible. So here you can see we have all of our files, where they are, but this column called total risk is of particular importance. Because essentially what this has done is it's taken our cognitive AI, it's extracted all of these different aspects about those items, and basically given it a risk score. That risk score allows me to effectively promote that item to the top of the list. And by putting it at the top of the list, I can easily jump to and start to identify that. And so here we can see I have what looks like a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet contains all manner of different disparate types of information. I could see account numbers, I could see dollar signs, etc. And so again, in all of those instances, it looks like something's going a little awry here. We'll pause and play that again. You can see sort of all of that information. So I've got social security numbers, I've got dollar figures, etc. And so what the risk score has done is it has basically analyzed this account list and said or this file, account list.csv, and essentially it's scored it. And you can see across all of these different dimensions that the whole idea is about promoting this information up. And so what we're just sort of looking at here, and again, let me pause that, is as part of that enrichment process, and I've referenced cognitive AI, for each of the items that we run through the process, we go through and we can define what is that item about. What are the dictionaries? Is it STEM? Is it arts and leisure? Is it finance? Is it sales? It also can be customized to your specific use case. So instead of just using our out-of-the-box models, you can actually dial that in and very much target your very specific needs around PII, or not just around PII, but also around sensitive intellectual property. You also then have our skill sets, and essentially these are more like document types. So imagine like a tax form or an invoice or a receipt, that if you're trying to sort of cut through huge volumes of information, the more information that you can glean up front about the complexion of that information, the better off you are. And so all of these can be applied very fast and efficiently during ingestion to help you hone in on what matters most contained within this information. And so to further that, it's easy to extend. So these are, essentially several hundred out of the box models. You can drill in, you can define, you can further tune these. And when we talk about tuning these, it's important to sort of take a step back and think about Nuix's overall AI strategy. So when we think about AI, first and foremost, we think in terms of responsible AI. And then across that responsible AI spectrum in our AI strategy, we have Nuix owned AI, and that is effectively enriched. These, we tune the models, we train the models, we are willing to share the inputs into these models, and we give you all the transparency to easily tweak and tune these. We have then Nuix integrated, which I'll touch on in a minute, and then ultimately the BYO, which is bring your own models or bring your own AI. But with this in mind, as you start to drive in and drill into each one of these, this is where you can start to really differentiate, not just on the out of the box, but if you're an organization and you're looking for your own sensitive information, you're concerned about intellectual property. So again, if we go back to X Corp Bank, for example, they may, be interested obviously in their account list, or they may have other sensitive information. Or if you're a pharmaceutical company, you may be interested in a different type of sensitive information. So a data privacy scan may actually be as effective around looking for your own sensitive information. And so how you can then think about that sensitive information is how you can start to build those models and define that and push that forward. So here we're now looking at the association of risk. So again, that idea of risk is using all of those building blocks. What is it? What is it? What type of document it is? What does it contain? What are the various facts contained with it to basically build that cumulative score? So in our example, when we're thinking about X Corp Bank, they had an issue. Their consumers were complaining. What we then did is said, okay, well, if we think we may potentially have had a data breach because I have this third party that's targeting our customers and asking them to send money to a specific Bitcoin address, odds are we have a data privacy issue. So we used Nuix Data Privacy, the data privacy or the Nuix Neo data privacy solution, to basically scan that information. That scan resulted in an account list that existed in someone's share, sort of outside its normal location. That account list was elevated to the top of the pile by using the risk scoring. And again, that classification categorization and that whole idea of being able to quickly and easily point you at sort of what matters most in that corpus. And so again, when we sort of take that, if I think about what we've done and we've sort of seen, we now it's reasonable to sort of think that we should probably start an investigation. How did that account list get to that location? And what should we be doing about it? So, now it's time to sort of move to the next sort of element of the Nuix Neo solution stack. So the first being data privacy, the second being Nuix investigation or Nuix Neo for investigations. So let's dig into the detail and really sort of understand the who, what, where, how, when, and why. So again, solutions start with workflows. How do I process that data? How do I get it into a format in which I can start to work with it and understand it? And what are all of the types of intelligence and artificial intelligence that I can apply to get to the right things that essentially matter most? So again, same model or same idea. We're going to now use the Nuix Neo investigation solution. And essentially that workflow has a bunch of different steps, everything from obviously the core text and metadata extraction, but we're doing optical character recognition across any of the individual items. We're running the data through Nuix NLP to enrich it. We're then actually also going to start to do some of the other steps, which is to actually do things like prompt on documents. So we're going to leverage the bring your own AI model, whereby you can define prompts and ask questions of that information using large language models, and then enrich those items with the output of those models. So again, a lot of flexibility as how you can really start to drive all manner of different workflows, including things like conditional workflows based off the outcome of all of these different decisions. So again, a tremendous amount of flexibility in how you can work through this. So here we're essentially showing question prompts and then follow-up prompts. Conditionality as to sort of when you do all of those. And so you can really start to really open up the landscape of what can be done to leverage generative AI. So we're back in, we're looking at investigate. So now that we're part of that investigations, maybe the first thing I would do is search for that account list. And quickly you can see that I've found a couple references to the account list. So I could see that the account list is being referenced over here as part of an email. There's specific email threads around sort of I want the money or various other aspects of that, etc. And so again, the ability to sort of drive and understand that and quickly get in and assess that is paramount. And so, continue to work through. Sorry, I keep pausing this inadvertently as I'm trying to move myself around. What you can see is I've actually now, golly, this is kind of awkward. There we go. Is basically, I've seen throughout this text thread that I now see a Bitcoin address. So again, I've got a text exchange that references an account list, and I also see a Bitcoin address or Bitcoin wallet contained within that. So let's sort of continue this. So what we'll do here is we'll now sort of do that same idea of being able to break down those silos, and I'll essentially run a custom link, which allows me to search my knowledge graph. And so you may recognize the knowledge graph. That's the same Bitcoin address that's associated with my consumer complaints. But I've now layered in additional information, additional context by pulling in all of the associated evidence. So my text messages, all of my other sort of documents, data, to be able to really sort of formulate that common view. This, again, I think is just kind of a little neat element. There happens to be some foreign language text. So again, I'm going to use a third-party translation service. So if you've got one in-house or behind your firewall, you can do that. I just happen to do it with Google Translate. So now we're kind of back, we are running through sort of what I would consider to be the analog style of investigations. I'm looking at documents, I'm running searches, I'm reviewing chat messages, I'm understanding communications, I'm understanding who's talking to who, the frequency of that. And again, all of this elements of being able to understand chat, whether or not the chat messages are from a mobile device. So whether it's SMS or whether it's WeChat or whether it's WhatsApp or it's Teams or it's Slack, or it's just sort of direct SMS. There are all these different sort of essentially traditional or standard investigative techniques that are available to you. So back to that idea of the funnel, being able to take all that different data, run it through, understand who's connecting to whom. We really sort of think of that as like, that's an analog style investigation. You're not leveraging any of sort of like the super advanced cutting edge AI, but it's still incredibly practical, and it is your day-to-day go-to. How do I understand, run searches, see who's talking to who? I now want to talk about sort of where we're going. It's sort of like that next phase. So when I talked about Nuix's AI strategy, I talked about the Nuix owned, I talked about sort of a little bit about the BYO around the prompting, and in the middle is the Nuix integrated. And this is where we've taken models from the broader marketplace and actually vetted and certified them and are cooking them in, and they're now included. So this includes E5, Clip, Whisper, and also FaceNet for allowing you to sort of do a whole bunch of different things. And so that transition from analog to sort of that digital world is really starting to understand how all of the advancements in AI can be leveraged within Nuix Neo to give you the greatest benefit and deliver those outcomes the fastest. So here, one of those things that we're doing is what we call semantic search. And so with semantic search, the idea is instead of being reliant purely on keywords, I can start to look for semantically similar documents. So here I am desperate for some cash, and I'm going to essentially run a search. And what this is doing is instead of searching for the actual keywords, I am desperate for cash or some cash, it is looking for what is essentially semantically similar. So it's more like a concept. What is similar in concept to the idea that I am desperate for cash? And then you can control your filter score to sort of see how much you want it to look like that. And so we'll run that. And really what this is doing is essentially converting that to a mathematical equivalent of that language. And so here, we've jumped in. And what we'll do is we'll pop this over here, keep moving myself around. As you can see, what we've found is a couple of different things around, you know, got any ideas for quick cash, or an email describing someone that's in financial trouble, or I'm in financial trouble after being sick. It doesn't necessarily say I'm desperate for cash, but it does say that I need money, or there's sort of all of those different words that I may or may not have found that were associated with a keyword search. And so here I've sort of expanded that. So I went from a 0.92 to a 0.91, and I've started to bring in more scope. And so again, no reindexing, no rework. I'm just increasing the effectiveness of my investigation. So all the way down now, I'm sort of looking down, financial trouble after being sick. Again, important note is, we're showing it in English, but one of the neat things about the vectorization and the conversion of this information to mathematics is that it works in a multilingual capacity. And so this is without requiring translation. So I haven't gone through and translated all of these text messages from one language to another. I'm actually just effectively issuing that query in a different language, but I'm going to get my hits back that were based in English. So again, this is a really fast and efficient way to think about early case assessment, that you can run this through, automatically convert things to vectors, and then start to see and experience that. So again, taking that huge leap forward with how we start to think about that information. Going to try it in a slightly different, so again, I hate this job, again, thinking about in terms of our scenario of X Corp Bank and investigating these individuals. Someone is under stress. They've been sick. They're now talking about maybe, but work's been killing me. So again, going to that motive. What is the pressure, rationalization, and opportunity that has led this person to essentially perform an insider threat? They're down here talking about Caribbean dreams. Do you ever feel like quitting this job and just moving to the Caribbean? So again, that idea of taking all of those elements. And so that last bit that we just sort of did really quickly was pivoting from being able to leverage semantic search purely for text base, but to images. So we can now use all of that same vector math to be able to connect and identify images as well. And so in that example, we just sort of found similar images. And so, or actually we're going to find similar images now. And so again, without any pre-tagging any aspect other than just converting these things to the universal language of math, we've been able to sort of find those similar items and jump directly to that. So now we'll go back and we'll sort of increase or sort of take a little bit of a spin through some of the other semantic search stuff, just because I think it's kind of interesting. So if I want to search for sports car, maybe you're thinking about rationalization or pressure or opportunity. So our primary suspect here maybe has been interested in a sports car. And this happens just to be showing the multilingual capability. So again, I'm searching in Chinese for red sports car. And again, getting the same results. Again, that multilingual aspect and that universal application of mathematics. And so now I've actually switched cases. This is a slightly different set of data. It's sort of, I'll pop this over here. And sort of that slightly different set of data is, a lot more image data. But I think it sort of really sort of highlight the power of the semantic search capability. So I'm going to search for family photo. And again, I get all manner of different family photos. I always find it funny that The Simpsons is also considered a family photo. But now family photo on a beach. Again, immediately shows what is clearly family photos on a beach and then with a dog. And I think what is super fantastic about this has required no upfront training. Like, these items haven't been tagged by an individual upfront. This is just leveraging all of the capability of semantic search for both images and photographs to be able to do this stuff quickly and efficiently and easily. So again, really, really powerful, really, really easy, and really, really effective when one starts to think about things like early case assessment or investigations, where you're trying to understand this information as quickly as possible, but you don't have really the time to sort of look at each of those individual elements. So this next piece, we're going to kind of continue. So moving on from sort of the semantic search. So again, I'll let this sort of play for just a second or so further. We talked about, our different aspects of strategy. So again, of AI strategy. So the Nuix owned, which is the cognitive AI, the enrich, so the classification, categorization, fact extraction. the Nuix integrated. That's where we were talking about the semantic search, where we were taking advantage of some of the open source models for creating text embeddings. So E5, Clip, that enables semantic search and a whole bunch of other things that we've done to make that easy to sort of essentially pull that into the Nuix Neo platform, all again on premise, on your 10, running where you want to. And now the last piece I sort of touched on when we were set up the workflow is around the generative AI and essentially being able to prompt on documents, prompt on images, etc. So what we've done is for each of those items, we essentially ran it against a generative AI system and said, hey, what do you think? Do you think there's fraud? Do you think there's risk? Do you think there's privileged information? And we're effectively storing that back onto the Nuix case such that it's searchable custom metadata is effectively started to think about color coding and really trying to draw your eye to anything that is effectively generative or AI specific. So you saw with the semantic search, we were using the purple color coding. You see with the generative AI, we're also highlighting things with purple. Again, this is all part of Nuix's responsible AI strategy, where we're effectively trying to draw you to and differentiate what we consider evidentiary information. So information that can be specifically highlighted and shown to exist within the corpus. So your keyword, your text, your metadata, all that type of stuff. So again, thinking about, how we are balancing and sort of really living that responsible AI strategy. So here what we've done is we've essentially run a custom metadata search to sort of define, what are the different types? Do I think there's privilege? Do I think there's, potential fraud? And again, these are the hits that are coming back. And all of this is done through the prompt on documents. And the great part about that prompt on document and the generative AI aspects is you've got tremendous flexibility to really differentiate your scenario or differentiate your use case or target the prompts in a way in which you feel is most beneficial, and then institutionalize that as part of a workflow. So again, you're not reliant just on our AI. You can use your own model. You can tune different model. You can leverage open source. You can leverage commercial. You can train your own. But the most important aspect of all of that is it really allows you to differentiate how you deliver that value and what those outcomes look like. So again, talked a lot about the tech there, but if we sort of go back to our story of X Corp Bank and sort of think that through from end to end, first we had the issue of, consumer complaints and being able to break down those data silos. Seems like X Corp Bank has a problem that their customers are being targeted by someone that wants them to transfer money to a Bitcoin address. We've conducted an investigation. We clearly see that some of the individuals, in this case, Pete and Sammy, were talking about all sorts of different things, so illustrating the core elements of fraud around pressure, rationalization, opportunity. They've got pictures of red sports cars talking about vacations, talking about hating their jobs. And you've kind of got the dead ringer if you've got a chat message that's showing that specific same Bitcoin address that's associated with the fraudulent or with the consumer complaints stating that they've been defrauded. So if you sort of take all of those things together, you've got a reasonable expectation that they need to prepare for litigation. And so when we think about preparation for litigation, again, we've talked about our different solutions. We've talked about data privacy. We've talked about investigations and now litigation. And so again, starts with a workflow. And that workflow allows us to very effectively and easily, kick off a job and really see it through. But since we're now expecting and working with litigation, the key piece is it's not just about the evidence. There's also the process. So you can send legal hold notices. You can define templates. You can define how you execute that survey. You can track, monitor, and maintain all of these. You can customize and tailor this. So again, easily move beyond the pure boundaries of the investigation, but really start to think about the entirety of your workflow and how I can execute and manage those legal holds as part of that reasonable anticipation of litigation. But now let's sort of say, all right, well, here we go. We got to move beyond that. How do we want to think about that? And so now it's time to start to get down and gather the data. So again, first step might be to apply a hold. And so one of the great things about Nuix Neo for Legal is our ability to support Microsoft's Purview APIs. So again, we can define all through, actually, this is probably worth pausing for a second. So One of the biggest sort of challenges we've heard around Purview is you kind of have to go into the Microsoft user experience, you define your rules and how you want to do it, and then you kind of wait for things to happen, and then you take the next stage, and then you maybe gather that data, bring it down to CDS, and then you go to processing. So we've simplified that entire process by allowing you to set those jobs up in Nuix Neo, pick your users from M365, define if you want SharePoint, OneDrive, or email, Teams, etc., all within the Nuix Neo legal and automate UI. And so again, by being able to define all of this, you've essentially created a singular workflow that will go completely end to end. So you're querying Purview, you're actually running the Purview search APIs, you're gathering that information, you're packaging it, you're downloading it, you're pulling that information together, and then you're actually able to then process that data all again as a single simple automated workflow. And so that single simple automated workflow then allows you to run from end to end. So you could set those holds, drive that data, process it, run the entire thing. And again, make that consistent, repeatable, and easy. And so here, again, we're now sort of taking a different step. We're going to look at some of the other aspects. And so again, as we've got here within the legal workflow, there's a lot of different ways in which you can think about it. Here, we're going to leverage all these different techniques to really help organizations think about focusing in on what matters most. So we've talked about process automation, all the standard stuff around date filtering, deduplication, pretty much you name it, keyword search, search and tag, denisting, all of the standard features of functionality are all essentially standard activities in Automate. But here we want to talk about some of the more leveraging the AI aspects. Again, thinking about focusing in on clustering to be able to define clustering using the vector embeddings, and then taking that next step with something like generative AI to start giving you document summaries and summarizing those individual clusters. So again, pulling all of these pieces together in consistent, repeatable workflows. So again, now we'll run that workflow. And again, one of the great things about Neo and sort of how Nuix is thinking is, what does it mean to effectively deliver that outcome? And so instead of just having, here's a set of documents, start looking at them, similar to what we've done with data privacy, where you have a magnitude report, we now have we have a cluster report. And essentially that cluster report allows you to sort of understand and define, what are the central nodes of those individual clusters? What does that look like? How can I then sort of navigate that and effectively jump into it? So similar to the magnitude report, how do I sort of, start to break down those barriers between what is a report, what is a visualization, and what are the actual items? And so here I've gone from that cluster report, jumped into the data itself, and I'm now able to look at it and quickly review and analyze it. So here now we're going through sort of what are essentially the cluster pivots, where we've defined sort of what are the most central items to those documents. We've then gone through, provided a cluster summary, an individual document summary, and think about rolling those summaries up, again, to really try to give you as much information as quickly as possible about that. And then obviously the last stage is eventually someone has to really sort of work through these. And so for us, it's again, the ability to easily promote to discover. So be able to take that same Nuix case where we've done all of that ECA, thought about enriching it with Nuix Cognitive AI, thought about early case assessment using semantic search and sort of being able to expand and understand our search terms, being able to prompt on documents, even to the extent that you might want to start considering pushing first pass review as far into ECA as possible. But now ultimately I need to promote it to discover, and I want to promote it to discover in a consistent and easy and automated fashion, including everything like the clustering, the document IDs, the names, any of that specific information, and essentially promote that such that I can continue my review. And again, all of this in a nice, easy, automated fashion. So again, that job will run, the information will be pushed up, and then I'll sort of quickly jump into Discover and just sort of see what that information looks like. So again, pulling all of these elements together into sort of the broader Nuix Neo end-to-end experience. And so by, you'll recognize some of these same items. So here I've got my printer age, where they're essentially taking sort of that central cluster. I can see, the same items, same information. I've got my doc IDs. I'm able to look through this information, understand the different aspects of the chat, then able to sort of switch my view and essentially go in and start to look at some of the promotive cognitive AI. So again, the AI enrichments sort of what is the type of document, what does it contain. So again, as much of that information as we can push onto those items as possible to really effectively accelerate those specific outcomes. And that includes not just sort of the classification and categorizations, but again, all of the different things about what are the types of records, what are the specific entities as you start to think about doing things like redaction, et cetera. So again, continuing to push, pull, and really sort of gain a lot of insights as quickly as possible. So when we are thinking through again, we've got our scenario where X Corp Bank, have the silos, did a data privacy or, sensitive information scan, and then conducted the investigation and then, anticipated legal. So run that process, have done their work. But I guess the last piece of that is, doesn't that seem sort of awkward that you're basically waiting for your customer to tell you that you have a problem? And so wouldn't it be great if you could get on your front foot and really start to understand that and understand that, potentially Pete, who's our primary suspect in this, maybe was having some of these thoughts, maybe was colluding. And then if you wanted to sort of really get ahead of that insider threat. So the last sort of piece is, let's get proactive with adaptive. So Nuix also has adaptive security. It is an endpoint digital behaviors capability that can be deployed. It tracks all of the actual digital events that are taking place, USB events, print events, does things like capture screenshots, keystrokes, etc., all in sort of a really easy, customizable fashion such that you can really get a tremendous lens into what's happening. And so here we've got Pete's PC. And so you've got Pete's PC. And so, I see my account list. If you really pay close attention, you can see that he's got an account list and it just happens to be in a folder called Friends List. So doing a little bit to obfuscate it. And then I've gone into essentially Google Drive into my folder called My Drive for Larry. And as easy as pie, you can see a friends list zip. So sort of a little bit of obfuscation. We're essentially watching a screen recording of what Pete's laptop would look like. And so again, this is just for the sake of the video. And right there, right there, within a blink, that data was exfiltrated. So we essentially took the data, dragged and dropped it out to the For Larry folder, and boom, data was exfiltrated. Now you may have lots of controls over that or all different types of things, but that's kind of difficult then to go back and prove, like a whole bunch of forensic analysis, all these different aspects to understand that Pete had actually done that. But so what if you were running adaptive security? So as I said, adaptive security is Nuix's endpoint and digital behaviors, gives you a lens into sort of everything that's happening on the monitored endpoints. Everything from, their user behaviors, what websites they visit, all the way down to sort of like really low level cybersecurity type behaviors and events that are going on. You can understand the process, look into that endpoint, and most importantly, you can define specific rule sets. So here we're going to look at our enterprise monitoring rule set. That sort of has some specific IT data exfil operations. What's really neat about this is fully customizable and tunable and scriptable to your specific requirements. How you think about this, whether or not you're looking across the enterprise or you have a handful of individuals within your organization that need to have that next level of monitoring. You can dial that in very easily and effectively with Nuix Adaptive Security. So again, different rules, all these different types. But what sort of is absolutely amazing is now we're going to drill in and look at sort of this individual endpoint is, so we had an event. That event was an exfil event. Let's go take a look. So what we've actually done is we are continuously capturing screenshots, like one every second. And so now we're effectively watching what is a playback of what I started this video with. So we are able to replicate and basically are keeping track of everything that is taking place, capturing screenshots, understanding those events. And so just sort of like that last piece, like right where it just sort of like flashed for just a split second, imagine if you were conducting an investigation and trying to interrogate or just question an employee about, did they take the data? And, they'd close down their Google account and sort of were denying everything. But yet you could produce for them a series of screenshots with their background, all of this aspects of them effectively dragging and dropping the data into that folder and be able to replay that back. And so when we think about sort of that end-to-end continuum, it's very much how do we start to think about taking that funnel, not only of documents and data, but essentially run it through that funnel using any techniques that we can to make that information as available and effective, uh, to help deliver your outcomes. So whether or not you're combating insider threats, you're doing litigation, you're doing law enforcement investigation, you're actually trying to break down those digital silos across all of those different disparate, not only data types, but different repositories. Nuix Neo provides an unbelievable capability to sort of understand that information, elevate those insights, and interact with that entire continuum of data and information. And so with that, I would like to thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed the show and look forward to any comments or feedback. So thank you very much. All right. Bye-bye.